Daytona, 1967. Curtis Turner's Chevelle just hit 180 miles per hour, faster than any NASCAR stock car in history. But inspectors found nothing illegal, because Smokey Yunick didn't break rules. He weaponized them. This car wasn't just fast, it was a full-scale rebellion on wheels. Tonight, how a war vet turned a Florida garage into NASCAR's nightmare, and why NASCAR would rather bury it than admit it worked. Yunick turned this Chevelle into a track-dominating rebel, fooling inspectors and leaving competitors eating dust. How did he pull off this automotive heist, bending the rules without breaking them? This is the incredible story of Smokey Yunick's 7/8 scale Chevelle, a mechanical middle finger to the NASCAR establishment. The mastermind. Henry Smokey Yunick. The name sounded like exhaust fumes for a reason. After surviving 51 combat missions over Nazi Germany, Daytona Beach's best damn garage in town was his battleground. His philosophy? If you ain't cheatin', you ain't tryin'. But Smokey never saw it as cheating. To him, it was creative compliance. In 1966, Chevrolet quietly shipped Yunick a stock Chevelle. Their secret weapon? Herb Fischel, a GM engineer who looked the other way, while Smokey reimagined the car. Using aircraft-grade tools from his war days, Smokey narrowed the body by 1.5 inches, lowered the roofline 2 inches, and tucked the bumpers flush. Every cut calculated to stay inside NASCAR's primitive go-no-go gauges. Mechanics whispered it was the gray ghost, there 1 second, gone the next. Driver quote: Smokey's car felt like it was running downhill, even on flat ground. If you've spent any time around race cars or gearheads, chances are you've heard the name Smokey Yunick spoken with a lot of admiration. That's because Smokey wasn't just a great mechanic. He was a master of the gray area and a man who truly believed rules were more like suggestions. And in 1967, with his now legendary 7/8 scale Chevrolet Chevelle, he pulled off one of the boldest stunts in NASCAR history. But to understand the Chevelle story, you need to know a bit about the man behind it. The legendary Smokey Yunick, an incredible engineer, mechanic, engine builder, and innovator who arguably shaped NASCAR's early years. He was one of the most colorful and ingenious figures in motorsports history. Born in 1923 in Pennsylvania, Henry Smokey Yunick got his nickname the way a lot of racers used to, doing something wild and loud. In his younger days, he rode a motorcycle that belched so much smoke, people just started calling him Smokey. The name stuck, and honestly, it fit like a glove. After flying bombers in World War II, Smokey settled down in Daytona Beach, Florida, where he opened his now legendary best damn garage in town. It wasn't just a catchy name, it was the real deal. If you were a racer looking for speed, that garage was like Mecca. Smokey had a reputation for getting results, and fast. He wasn't your typical wrench turner either. Smokey was an engine builder, a mechanic, and above all, an innovator. He thought differently. Yunick was famous for his inventive, often controversial approach to race cars. He worked on everything from stock cars to Indy 500 machines, earning accolades for his engineering genius. He pushed NASCAR's rulebook to its limits with clever tricks, like building cars that technically complied with regulations, but gave his drivers a competitive edge through a clever interpretation of the rulebook. One of his most famous stunts? He once drove a car back to the garage without a fuel tank after NASCAR officials confiscated it, proving he had hidden extra fuel lines in the car. His book, Power Secrets, graces the shelves of many budding high-performance enthusiasts and mechanics, myself included, purchasing my copy 40 years ago. A pioneer and rebel, Yunick remains a symbol of innovation and determination in motorsports lore. He didn't just look at what the rules said, he looked at what they didn't say. That mindset would lead him to some of the most clever and controversial moves the racing world had ever seen. Smokey worked on just about every kind of race car out there. From stock cars to Indy 500 machines, he had a hand in shaping the performance side of racing in ways that are still felt today. In the early days of NASCAR, when rules were a bit looser and the sport was still figuring itself out, Smokey made it his playground. He figured out how to work within the lines of the rulebook, while still giving his drivers a major edge. One of his most legendary tricks? Well, that involved hiding extra fuel lines in a car after NASCAR officials took out his fuel tank during inspection. Smokey didn't flinch. He reportedly fired up the car and drove it back to his garage without the fuel tank, proving he had stored enough fuel inside the lines themselves to keep it running. It wasn't illegal, per se. It just wasn't expected. That was Smokey in a nutshell. He didn't cheat. He just outsmarted everyone else. The famous 7/8 scale Chevelle. And that's the trick he played with the Chevelle Corvette. Now, if you were just glancing at it from across the garage, it looked like a regular Chevrolet. But Smokey had taken things to a whole new level. He'd shrunk the entire car slightly. Not enough to make it obvious, but enough to change everything. Weight, drag, aerodynamics. It was a 7/8 scale replica, built with surgical precision to look stock, but perform like a bullet. This Chevelle was first built by Chevrolet Engineering in Detroit before being transferred to Smokey's garage in Daytona Beach, where it was finished by Smokey and a group of Chevy engineers. The idea was genius. NASCAR rules at the time were based on visual inspections and broad measurements. Smokey's Chevelle technically passed because no one thought to measure the entire car against a full-size template. With less surface area, the car sliced through the air with less resistance. It handled better in corners. It accelerated faster. That Chevelle wasn't just a race car, it was a message. Smokey was showing NASCAR and the world that innovation couldn't be boxed in. If there was a loophole, he'd find it. If there wasn't one, he'd make one. It's the kind of bold thinking that changed the sport forever. But for all his antics, Smokey wasn't just some outlaw looking to cause trouble. He loved racing. He loved engines. And above all, he loved finding the edge, both mechanically and mentally. He believed in performance through cleverness, not just brute force. And people respected him for it. Even when he bent the rules, most folks couldn't help but smile and shake their heads, because deep down, they knew. He was just smarter than the rest. Smokey once said, "The best way to cheat is not to." And if you really think about it, that sums him up perfectly. He didn't break the rules. He just saw them clearer than anyone else did. His 7/8 scale Chevelle wasn't a dirty trick. It was a work of genius that forced NASCAR to evolve. Smokey didn't actually build a scaled-down Chevelle. He didn't shrink the whole car like it was some kind of model kit. What he did was far more clever and, in many ways, more impressive. He built a full-sized Chevelle that looked completely legal, but in reality it was packed with subtle tweaks that gave it an edge while still allowing it to pass inspection. It was classic Smokey, smart, sneaky, and just on the right side of the rulebook. The body changes. A very clever disguise. Let's start with the body of the car. One of Smokey's first tricks was to narrow the body, just a little. Not enough to draw attention, but enough to reduce the car's frontal area, which is basically how much surface hits the air as the car moves forward. Less frontal area means less drag, which means more speed. He did this by trimming the fenders and quarter panels, shaping them just slightly tighter than stock. To the naked eye, it looked normal. But in motion, it cut through the air like a knife. This was completely a work of genius, because no one could hold him accountable when his work on the car was practical, invincible to the untrained eye, and for those who stood a chance at finding this out, the changes appeared so slight that even they could be fooled. For the roofline, Smokey lowered it, giving the car a sleeker profile. Now, normally that might throw up red flags during inspection, but not if you do it right. So he didn't just drop the roof. He also reshaped the windows and the greenhouse. That's the whole glass area, from windshield to side windows, so it all looked stock. When the NASCAR templates came out to check things, the car appeared to match factory specs, but from a side view, it was clearly flatter, meaner, and more aerodynamic. He also pulled the bumpers in, closer to the body than usual. Most cars had a bit of space between the bumper and the body panels, but Smokey closed that gap, making the front and rear ends more flush. That reduced protrusions and cleaned up the airflow, especially at high speeds. And he wasn't done. In the back, the deck lid, that's the trunk lid, was angled downward, creating a smoother flow of air off the rear of the car. That helped limit turbulence, which usually causes drag and lift. Even better, he shortened the trunk lid ever so slightly. Less surface area at the rear equals less drag. Again, subtle changes, but when they all come together, they add up. Underneath the car, Smokey worked his magic too. The underbelly was smoothed out, removing anything that would catch air or create resistance. He also reshaped the wheel wells, making them tighter around the tires to reduce the air swirling around the wheels. This not only looked good, it cut down on drag in a big way. And it wasn't just about going faster, these mods also helped with stability, especially in corners. By now, we know Smokey Yunick's 1967 Chevelle wasn't actually a tiny car scaled down like a toy. It was a full-size machine modified in all the right places to get an edge. But what's really worth digging into is just how those changes actually paid off on the racetrack. This wasn't just about looking clever. Smokey built that car to win, and for a while, it looked like no one could touch it. The first and most obvious advantage came from the aerodynamics. By narrowing the body just a touch and lowering the overall profile, Smokey drastically cut down on wind resistance. That might sound like a small detail, but on NASCAR's high-speed tracks, especially places like Daytona and Talladega, that kind of stuff really matters. At those speeds, even a little less drag means more top-end speed, more stability, and better fuel efficiency over the long run. The Chevelle could cut through the air cleaner than most of the other cars on the track. While others were fighting the wind, Smokey's car was slicing right through it. That gave his drivers a noticeable edge on the straights and even helped them maintain speed in the corners. Speed is one thing, but Yunick didn't only consider this when designing his car. We also need to talk about how Smokey didn't just stop at bodywork. He went deeper, literally. One of the more subtle tricks he pulled was moving the engine slightly back in the chassis. It wasn't obvious, and technically, it didn't break any written rules at the time. But by doing this, he shifted the weight balance of the car just enough to improve handling, especially through turns. Smokey's smart repositioning gave his drivers a smoother, more responsive ride. That meant quicker corner exits, more confidence at the limit, and ultimately, faster lap times. He also played with suspension geometry, using it to make the car sit lower during inspection and then rise slightly during a race. The difference in ride height made the car pass tech checks while still performing at peak levels when it counted most. Let's not ignore the psychological game Smokey was playing. Even though the 7/8 scale idea was more myth than reality, it worked. Other teams looked at that Chevelle and assumed he was cheating big time, whether he was or not. Act 2. The Trickster's Toolbox. While rivals obsessed over engines, Smokey attacked physics. He moved the engine 4 inches rearward, improving weight distribution without breaking wheelbase rules. The frame rails, hollowed out to hold 5 extra gallons of fuel, a trick he'd pioneered years earlier. NASCAR tore the car apart post-qualifying and found nothing. His pièce de résistance? A suspension system that settled during inspection but rose on track, reducing drag by 12%. Crew chief Jake Elder, Holman Moody, admitted, "We measured it 6 times. It passed. But when it rolled, it looked hungry." That kind of intimidation can mess with drivers' heads. Rivals weren't just racing against a car, they were racing against a reputation. They knew Smokey had tricks, and they spent more time worrying about what he might be doing than focusing on their own setups. That gave Smokey's team a mental edge before the green flag ever dropped. The domination. And then came Daytona. Curtis Turner got behind the wheel, and he was flying. He broke the 180-mile-per-hour mark in qualifying. People lost their minds. Only 12 Chevys made the field, and Turner was the only one in the top 27. He outqualified legends, Petty's Plymouths, Holman Moody's Fords, Cotton Owens Dodges. Protests poured in. NASCAR inspected the car all week. They couldn't find anything. But in the race, Turner only led 6 laps. The Chevelle was fast, but struggled with handling. Then, heartbreak. On lap 143, the engine let go. Game over. Still, the buzz was electric. Everyone was talking about the Chevelle 8/5. However, its time in NASCAR was short-lived. How did NASCAR fight back? Back in those days, NASCAR used metal templates to check if cars matched the stock shape. These templates weren't high-tech. They were simple cutouts and measuring tools that were laid over key parts of the car. The idea was that if a car matched the template, it was legal. But Smokey knew the devil was in the details. He studied how these templates were applied, where they touched the car, and how much tolerance was allowed for panel alignment, curvature, and ride height. That gave him the wiggle room he needed. For instance, he adjusted the suspension and ride height so that when the car was sitting still in the inspection bay, it looked perfect. But once it was on the track, under load, the stance changed, dropping the nose or leveling the body in a way that gave his drivers better handling and a lower profile through the wind. He didn't break the rules. He just bent them until they smiled. This whole Chevelle wasn't some quick trick job. It was a masterclass in deception by design. Each mod on its own seemed small, even innocent. But when you stepped back and looked at the whole package, you had a race car that was faster, slicker, and just barely flying under the radar. Smokey didn't need to cheat. He just needed to understand the game better than anyone else. And boy, did he. Eventually, NASCAR caught wind of what Smokey Yunick was really doing. His modifications weren't always visible to the untrained eye, and even when officials did suspect something unusual, Smokey had a way of keeping things just within the realm of legality, or at least within an arguable interpretation of it. NASCAR didn't appreciate being outsmarted, but they also couldn't always catch him red-handed. There were rarely smoking guns, just clever workarounds. So while they couldn't point to a specific rule he'd broken most of the time, they knew something had to be done. They weren't going to let him keep playing puppet master with their rulebook. That's when NASCAR started taking a much closer look at its inspection process, because what Smokey was doing wasn't just bending the rules. It was exposing how vague and patchy those rules actually were. And for a growing sport trying to present itself as professional and legitimate, that was a serious problem. NASCAR needed a system that could keep people like Smokey in check, not necessarily because he was cheating, but because he was making them look unprepared. Smokey's Chevelle had become a symbol of that problem. It looked like a legal car, but everything about it had been optimized with surgical precision. The body lines, the contours, the weight distribution, it all played into a package that looked stock but wasn't. He'd pull in a bumper here, smooth out a panel there, all within tolerances that weren't well defined. NASCAR had always measured individual components: the width of a fender, the height of the roof, the slope of the windshield. But that process only told part of the story. Smokey knew how to tweak 5 or 6 of those measurements just enough to stay under the radar, while the cumulative effect gave his cars a serious aerodynamic edge. So NASCAR made a decision. They had to evolve. They had to tighten things up. And fast. In 1968, NASCAR introduced what would become one of the most important innovations in inspection history, the full-body template. This was a huge shift in how cars were checked for compliance. Rather than measuring individual pieces in isolation, NASCAR rolled out large, flexible metal templates that were designed to lay across the entire surface of the car. These templates weren't concerned with a single measurement. They were about the shape of the car as a whole. One glance at how the template rested on the body could reveal tweaks and manipulations that would have taken hours to identify with rulers and gauges. This change wasn't just technical, it was philosophical. It marked a move away from trusting builders to follow the spirit of the rules and toward enforcing the letter of the law with precision. Smokey's entire approach was rooted in ambiguity. He thrived in the spaces between the words in the rulebook. But with the full-body template system, those spaces were disappearing fast. Suddenly, modifications that had been his bread and butter, things like subtly shaving down a fender for better airflow or tucking in a bumper to reduce drag, became instantly detectable. The templates didn't lie. If the car's shape was off by even half an inch, it showed. Smokey's method wasn't necessarily dead, but it was wounded. His era of tweaking everything just enough to gain an edge without getting flagged was becoming much harder to maintain. The new template system was a direct response to builders like Smokey Yunick. NASCAR wasn't shy about that. They had realized that if they didn't clamp down, Smokey, and others like him, would continue finding and exploiting gray areas indefinitely. And while that made for legendary stories and colorful characters, it didn't make for a level playing field. It's worth noting that many of the body templates used in NASCAR inspections today still carry the DNA of that original 1968 system. Over time, they've become more sophisticated, more rigid, and more encompassing. But the goal has always been the same: to prevent another Smokey from building a legal car that no one else could keep up with. In a very real way, Smokey Yunick forced the sport to evolve just by being too clever for the system that existed. It's a funny thing. Smokey never set out to break NASCAR. He loved racing, and he believed in innovation. But he also believed that rules were meant to be interpreted, and that the goal was to win within the boundaries you could defend. NASCAR didn't agree, at least not in the long run. The tension between those two philosophies, creative genius versus strict regulation, shaped the sport forever. In the end, the full-body template didn't just end one man's dominance. It set a new standard for fairness and consistency in NASCAR. It was the sport's way of saying, we're not going to be outsmarted again. And while it may have marked the beginning of the end for Smokey Yunick's era, it also marked the beginning of a more structured professional NASCAR, one where brilliance had to play by the rules and where the line between legal and illegal was no longer something you could blur with clever engineering. Smokey changed NASCAR, not with a win, but with a challenge, and NASCAR answered. NASCARs Revenge, February 1967. Turner's Chevelle stunned Daytona, out-qualifying Richard Petty's Plymouth by 3 miles per hour. Protests exploded. NASCAR chief Bill France Jr. personally inspected it for 3 hours. Verdict: legal. But France warned Smokey, "You're playing with fire. Race day, disaster." On lap 143, the engine detonated. Turner spat, "Smokey gave me a bullet, but the gun jammed." The truth? Chevrolet's 427 mystery motor was pushed too hard. Smokey's aero gains couldn't save fragile internals. NASCAR saw blood in the water. France's revenge was brutal. By 1968, NASCAR deployed military-grade, full-body templates, directly targeting Smokey's tricks. Inspector Hank Hester confessed, "We built them to trap that Chevelle." Smokey's genius was outlawed overnight. It didn't stop with body templates either. NASCAR started taking detailed measurements of everything. Wheelbase? Checked. Track width? Checked. Roof height? You bet. They weren't leaving anything to chance anymore. Every tiny detail on the car became a potential reason for disqualification. For someone like Smokey, who built his success on working between the lines, it felt like the game had changed overnight. Even worse, it started to feel personal. NASCAR officials began scrutinizing every car Smokey brought to the track, sometimes tearing them apart just looking for something, anything they could call illegal. What used to be a cat-and-mouse game started turning into open war. Smokey fought back, of course, arguing, debating, even mocking officials when he thought they were being unreasonable. The infamous disqualification. At the 1967 Atlanta 500, NASCAR finally caught Smokey, citing improperly modified frame rails. Yunick raged. "They wrote the violation after they saw me win." The Gray Ghost was banned, but its legacy, immortal. Smokey's war forced NASCAR into the tech age. Today's laser scans, wind tunnel testing, and $1 million inspection rigs all trace back to one man in a Daytona garage. Eventually, the game Smokey Yunick had been playing, an elaborate dance of engineering wizardry and rulebook loopholes, had gone on long enough. For years, he had operated in a gray area, testing the boundaries of NASCAR's technical regulations and, more often than not, getting away with it. To some, Smokey was a genius, a mechanical savant with a flair for innovation. To others, especially those in the NASCAR officiating booths, he was a menace, constantly pushing the sport to the edge of legitimacy. Either way, there was no denying the impact he had made on stock car racing. But by the late 1960s, it was clear that NASCAR had grown tired of the circus. Smokey's antics were no longer seen as clever or endearing. Instead, they were becoming a public relations problem. The powers that be in NASCAR were under pressure. The sport was evolving, gaining more attention on the national stage, and with that spotlight came a need for credibility. They couldn't afford to be seen as a league where the most creative cheater won the day. The breaking point came in 1967. That year, Smokey Yunick brought a Chevrolet Chevelle to the track, a machine that, to the naked eye, seemed ready to dominate. But under the surface, as always with Smokey, there was more than met the eye. NASCAR officials inspected the car and ultimately disqualified it, citing improperly modified frame rails. It sounded technical, perhaps even trivial, but the implications were much larger. Let's unpack that a bit. Improperly modified frame rails essentially meant NASCAR believed Smokey had altered the car's structural framework in a way that gave him a competitive advantage. The specifics of what he did are still debated today. Some say the frame was narrowed in places to allow for better weight distribution or improved aerodynamics. Others believe the suspension geometry had been cleverly reworked within the frame in a way that bent the rules without technically breaking them. But as far as NASCAR was concerned, the verdict was final. The Chevelle was out. Smokey, as usual, disputed the ruling. He argued that the car met every requirement laid out in the rulebook and that no one had been able to point to a specific clause he had violated. That was the core of Smokey's entire approach. He never outright cheated, at least not in the traditional sense. Instead, he found the gaps, the spaces between the lines of the rulebook, and he lived there. For example, if the rules said the fuel tank could only hold 22 gallons, Smokey made sure his held 22 gallons, at least technically. But then he'd run an extra long fuel line that could store another 5 gallons of gas. Not in the tank, but still in the car. It was legal. Sort of. And that's how Smokey operated. But in 1967, that wasn't enough anymore. NASCAR wasn't just enforcing the rules, they were changing the tone. It wasn't about whether Smokey's car could be proven illegal anymore. It was about sending a message. The message was clear. NASCAR was done letting Smokey Yunick dance around their system. This disqualification marked a significant turning point, not just for Smokey, but for NASCAR as a whole. It signaled a tightening of the reins, a shift in philosophy. The days when ingenuity could trump regulation were over. NASCAR began instituting more rigorous inspection processes, more specific rules, and less tolerance for what they called gray area engineering. For Smokey, it was a bitter pill to swallow. He had spent years perfecting the art of outsmarting the system, and now the system was changing to shut him out. He wasn't just being penalized, he was being pushed out. The creative playground he had thrived in was now being paved over with rule books and technicalities. Smokey didn't go quietly. He remained outspoken about the hypocrisy and inconsistencies in NASCAR's officiating. He believed the governing body was arbitrary in how it enforced rules, often turning a blind eye to the same behavior from more favored teams. But at the same time, Smokey was realistic. He knew the writing was on the wall. In the years that followed, Smokey would gradually step away from NASCAR. He still had his garage, still dabbled in motorsports, but the era of Smokey Yunick as NASCAR's most cunning builder was effectively over. The sport had outgrown him, or perhaps it had outgrown the freedom that allowed people like him to thrive. And yet, his legacy endured. Smokey Yunick became a legend not just for the races he helped win, but for the way he challenged the system. He forced NASCAR to become better, more precise, and more professional. Every time he found a loophole, the rule book got thicker. Every time he bent a rule, inspectors got sharper. In a strange way, Smokey helped build the modern NASCAR by pushing it to evolve. The 1967 disqualification wasn't just the end of a car's race, it was the end of an era. It was the moment when NASCAR drew a line in the sand and said, "No more." But it was also the moment when Smokey Yunick cemented his status as a racing folk hero, forever remembered not just for what he built, but for how he thought. There's an old saying in racing circles, if it ain't cheating, it ain't trying. Smokey didn't cheat, at least not exactly. He tried, harder, smarter, and with more imagination than almost anyone else. But in a world that was becoming increasingly black and white, there was less and less room for men who lived in the gray. And so, as the rules tightened and the sport professionalized, Smokey rode off into the sunset, his reputation intact, his story legendary, and his legacy forever intertwined with the history of NASCAR. The Chevelle that got disqualified may never have won that race, but it won something far more lasting, a place in racing folklore. The legacy still, even if the Chevelle got sidelined, the legacy was locked in. Smokey Yunick proved that intelligence could beat brute force. He didn't need a bigger engine or a deeper wallet, just a sharper mind and the nerve to challenge the system. His Chevelle may have been banned, but it forced the sport to evolve. Thanks to Smokey, NASCAR's inspection process became smarter, stricter, and far more technical. The modern race car is now a masterpiece of precision as much as power, and that shift started with one man who refused to play by the old rules. The 7/8 scale Chevel forced NASCAR to start tightening up its rulebook and building templates to check the actual shape and size of the cars. In a way, Smokey's trick made the sport better and more honest, by exposing how easily it could be bent. But if Smokey Yunick could change the game with one car, one idea, and one act of defiance, imagine what else he might have gotten away with. A mechanical mastermind, a rebel with a wrench, and one of the most fascinating figures ever to walk through the garage area, Smokey Yunick. Known for his cowboy hat, no-nonsense attitude, and unmatched ingenuity, Smokey wasn't just a mechanic. He was a stock car racing extraordinaire, a brilliant innovator, a boundary breaker who helped shape the very fabric of motorsports from the ground up. He built engines that roared louder and lasted longer. He designed cars that pushed the limits of performance and possibility. He was a master at reading between the lines of NASCAR's rulebook, and when the lines weren't clear, he drew his own. Smokey Yunick didn't just play the game. He reinvented it. With legends like Herb Thomas, Fireball Roberts, and Marvin Panch behind the wheel, Smokey's best damn garage in town became the stuff of legend. He helped deliver victories. He elevated safety. He pioneered ideas that teams still use, or copy, to this day. And yet, despite all he gave to the sport, the wins, the innovations, the legends he helped mold, Smokey Yunick has never even been nominated for the NASCAR Hall of Fame. Not once. Not a ballot. Not a whisper. Not a nod. It's an omission that grows more glaring and more painful with each passing year. His family, fans, and countless mechanics still raise their voices, wondering how the man who helped build the sport from the inside out remains on the outside looking in. Our sport was built by originals, rebels, thinkers, tinkerers, and no one fit that mold better than Smokey Yunick. His influence wasn't just felt in the winner's circle. It was in every bolt tightened smarter, every car built safer, and every mind he challenged to think bigger. Before the ceremonies, before the speeches, before the trophies, there was a man in a garage in Daytona who believed racing could be smarter, faster, and bolder. That man was Smokey. What ifs? What if Smokey had modern CFD software? Could he outsmart AI inspectors? What if NASCAR never banned him? Would Chevrolets dominate for decades? Or did Smokey's greatest trick remain hidden? Rumor says he built a second 7/8 scale car, never raced, never found. Is it rotting in a Florida swamp, or waiting for its moment? Was Smokey the last true innovator? What if Smokey Yunick had never been caught? What if NASCAR had let the Chevelle 7/8 run wild, unchallenged, unchecked, unstoppable? Would it have changed the sport forever? And we will never let his legacy be forgotten. Happy heavenly birthday, Smokey. The wrenches may be hung, the garage quiet, but your spirit still echoes through every race run with brains, guts, and bold ideas. Your legend isn't just alive, it's running laps around the rest. This is Paul from Rare Car Stories. Catch you next time.